this year, we mourned the end of one of the great cultural achievements of our time when Larry David's HBO sitcom Curb Your Enthusiasm finally ended. Curb has been on the air for over 20 years, which means that I have been watching this show since I was in high school. For 2 decades, Curb Your Enthusiasm has been a staple in the Cohen family household. My parents, my siblings, and I can literally have entire conversations consisting of nothing but Larry David quotes. Larry David never does what you expect. When everyone else zigs, Larry David zags. In an early episode of this series, when someone asks Larry to take a tour of her new house, he declines. I get it, he says. It's a house. It's got bathrooms, walk-in closets. I get it. I don't need the tour. Anyone else in the world would have taken that house tour, but not Larry David. When 2 girls come to his house on Halloween, he refuses to give them candy because he deems them to be too old to be trick-or-treating. Instead of just giving them the candy like anybody else would do, he lectures them about their age. And when his non-Jewish in-laws ask him what he got his wife for Christmas, he doesn't say, actually, I haven't gotten around to getting her a gift yet, which you might expect him to say. He says, I think I'm going to give her my grandfather's tallis. Larry David is the ultimate confounder of expectations. He never does what society dictates you should do or what you might expect him to do. And what makes Larry David so funny? And really, what makes a joke funny in the first place? What is it ultimately that elicits laughter? That's a question that philosophers have been debating and wrestling with for thousands of years. In ancient Greece, Plato put forth what has come to be known as the superiority theory of laughter. Plato says that ultimately laughter is an expression of delight in the downfall of others. That's why you laugh when you see someone getting hit in the face with a pie. According to this theory, humor at its core is rooted in mockery or derision, what Plato called a slightly spiritualized snarl. In other words, according to Plato, laughter comes at the expense of the suffering of others. But in the 18th century, the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant offered a very different theory of laughter. Kant put forth what has come to be known as the incongruity theory, which argues that laughter is ultimately rooted in an incongruity between expectation and reality. We laugh when things surprise us, when we see something that we think of as being out of place, or something we don't expect, like Larry David giving his grandfather's tallis as a Christmas present. We laugh when there is a surprising incongruity between the setup of a joke and the punchline of a joke. 2 beggars were sitting in front of the Trevi Fountain in Rome. One beggar had a hat in front of him decorated with a crucifix on it, and the other had a hat in front of him with the Star of David on it. And as people walked by, everyone was putting money only in the hat with the crucifix on it. And finally, a priest walked by the fountain and says to the man with the Jewish star in his hat, "Sir, this is a Catholic city. No one's going to put money in a hat with the Star of David on it. In fact, you sitting here makes it more likely that the Catholics will put money in the hat with the crucifix on it." And with that, one beggar turned to the other and said, "Hey, Moshe, look who's trying to teach the Cohen brothers economics." Why did you laugh at that joke? Because the punchline inverted your expectations. And the essence of laughter lies in the inversion of expectations. The origin of that idea, that laughter is rooted in surprise or in the confounding of expectations, can be found in this morning's Torah reading. The Torah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which recounts the birth of our patriarch Yitzchak, whose name literally means laughter. To give you some context, Sarah, Abraham's wife, the first Jewish woman, had been struggling with infertility for decades. A few chapters before this morning's Torah reading, God visits Abraham and delivers the news to him that at the age of 90 years old, Sarah will finally become pregnant. And how does Abraham respond to that news? He laughs. Vayipol Avraham al panav vayitzchak, and Abraham fell on his face and he laughed. The Torah tells us that through peals of laughter, Abraham says to God, "Come on, God, really? I'm 100, my wife is 90. Do you really expect me to believe that we're going to have a kid?" The idea is so absurd to Abraham that he literally laughs in God's face. It's an inversion of that old Yiddish expression, "A Mensch tragt und Gott lacht," man plans and God laughs. In this case, God planned and man laughed. But as he is laughing, God says to Abraham, Abraham, this is no laughing matter. Your wife, Sarah, shall indeed bear you a son, and you shall name him Yitzchak, which means laughter. And I will maintain my covenant with him and all of his descendants for the rest of time. And in this morning's Torah reading, we read of the birth of Yitzchak itself. As we read this morning, Vatomer Sarah tzchok asa li Elohim, kol hashomea Yitzchak li. And Sarah said, God brought me laughter, and everyone who hears of the birth of my child will laugh with me. Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90 when Yitzchak was born. As Shakespeare once wrote, with mirth and laughter, let old wrinkles come. In his commentary on the story of the birth of Isaac, the great 19th century German rabbi, Samson Raphael Hirsch, wrote the following words: the very beginning of the Jewish people is a historic absurdity. Its history, its expectations, its hope, its whole life must seem a monstrous, ludicrous pretension. That is why, until this very day, the existence of the Jewish people must appear to all narrow-minded deniers of God as the greatest absurdity possible. The resounding, raucous laughter that has followed the Jews upon their path through history is the most cogent proof of the divine character of their path. Laughter doesn't disturb us because we were already prepared for this laughter from the very beginning. In other words, the mere existence of the Jewish people is the greatest inversion of expectations in history. We are a people born in laughter. We came from a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman. And the inversion of expectations that we read about this morning laid the foundation for the Jewish people to continue confounding the world's expectations again and again and again for thousands of years. If the essence of laughter lies in the inversion of expectations, then the continued existence of the Jewish people is the single greatest joke the world has ever known. And this year, more than any year that I can remember, has been a year defined by the confounding of expectations. As we all know far too well, on October 7th, exactly a year ago this week, we experienced the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. On Simchat Torah, a day that should have been the happiest, most joyous day on the Jewish calendar, hundreds of Hamas terrorists poured into southern Israel from the Gaza Strip and launched the bloodiest attack in Israeli history. Among the communities hit the hardest on that terrible day was Kibbutz Be'eri, a beautiful farming community in southern Israel near the eastern border of the Gaza Strip. Be'eri was established on October 6th, 1946. Ironically, the massacre of October 7th happened just one day after the 77th anniversary of the kibbutz's establishment. And for 77 years, the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri lived peacefully, for the most part, with their neighbors in Gaza. In fact, among the kibbutzim in the Negev, Be'eri was particularly well known for its pro-peace proclivities. The kibbutzniks there had even established a special fund to provide financial assistance to Gazan day laborers who worked on the kibbutz, and residents from Be'eri would often volunteer to drive sick Palestinians to hospitals in southern Israel so they could receive the kind of medical treatment they did not have access to in Gaza. But as it turned out, none of that mattered. On October 7th, 132 members of Be'eri were brutally murdered by Hamas. 32 were kidnapped and taken hostage in Gaza, and 125 homes on that kibbutz were either severely damaged or entirely destroyed. I have never been to Kibbutz Be'eri, but I was at Kibbutz Kfar Aza, which is just down the road, on our Temple Beth Shalom mission to Israel this past March. Kfar Aza suffered a very similar fate to Be'eri, and walking through the burned out ruins of that kibbutz felt like what it must have felt like to walk through the aftermath of the Chmelnytsky massacre, or the Kishinev pogrom, or Kristallnacht. It was like walking through the darkest, most depraved pages of Jewish history. And yet, Despite the destruction and the desolation, this past summer, something miraculous happened at Be'eri. In August, Elad and Mika Dubnov, who grew up on the kibbutz, stood beneath the chuppah and were married in the first wedding to take place at kibbutz Be'eri since October 7th. Elad's best friend, Davida Bachar, who lost his wife, his son, and his leg on October 7th, stood with Elad and Mika beneath the chuppah and led them in the Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings to sanctify their marriage. The couple celebrated, they danced, they laughed. And not only did they get married at Be'eri, but they are actually now moving back to the kibbutz where they plan to raise their family. To quote the Haftarah we will be reading tomorrow, Hafachti evlam l'sason, their mourning was turned into joy. Elad and Mika's story is the definition of the inversion of expectations. Hamas planned, and they laughed. Next week will mark 1 year since October 7th. 1 year since our sense of security was shattered and our lives as Jews were forever changed, which also means that it's 1 year since the worst security and intelligence failure in Israeli history. A year ago, on the high holidays, I stood at this very spot on this bima and I spoke about the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And I said on that day that Israel has never been caught off guard like it was in 1973 again. Days later, just days later on October 7th, I was eating those words. But almost exactly a year since the worst intelligence failure in its history, Israel carried out a series of the greatest intelligence successes in its history. 3 weeks ago, Israel successfully hit thousands of Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon through explosive devices strategically placed in their beepers in one of the most creative and successful clandestine military operations the world has ever seen. 2 weeks ago, the Israeli Air Force destroyed roughly half of Lebanon's arsenal of missiles and rockets, crippling its ability to continue firing rockets into northern Israel. Lebanon has been building that arsenal of missiles and rockets for 3 decades, and Israel destroyed half the stockpile in 1 day. And of course, as we all know, this past Friday, Israel successfully killed Hassan Nasrallah, who led the terrorist organization Hezbollah for 32 years. Nasrallah and Hezbollah have spent decades not only firing thousands of rockets at Israel, but also targeting Jews around the world. In 1994, under Nasrallah's leadership, Hezbollah bombed the Jewish community center in Argentina, killing 90 people. In 2012, they blew up a tour bus in Bulgaria filled with Israeli tourists. For over 30 years, Nasrallah has been the arch-enemy of the Jewish people. And in the weeks leading up to the first anniversary of our worst defeat, we defeated him. And just 2 days ago, on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, Iran fired 180 ballistic missiles that landed all over Israel. But miraculously, thanks to the Iron Dome and to assistance from the United States and Jordan, both of whom helped Israel to intercept the missiles, only 2 people were lightly injured in that attack on Tuesday. 2 people. It's remarkable. Once again, we have defied the expectations of Lebanon, of Iran, and of the rest of the world. That's what the Jewish people have always done, and it's what we always will do. And here too, in the United States over this past year, we have witnessed a remarkable inversion of expectations. According to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, this past year was the worst year for anti-Semitism in the United States since the ADL began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1964. In 2023, there was an average of 1 anti-Semitic incident in this country per hour. 1 anti-Semitic incident every single hour. And it should not be a surprise to any of you to hear that the situation is at its absolute worst on college campuses. Campus anti-Semitism was a problem before October 7th, but since October 7th, it has risen to unprecedented levels. According to the ADL, this past year, anti-Semitic incidents on campuses across the country were up 300%. 300%. It's a staggering number. During the 2023-2024 academic year, 73% of college students in America either experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism on campus. And Jewish students now feel far less comfortable publicly identifying as Jews. At the end of the spring semester last year, I invited our TBS college students to come here to our synagogue to share with me what they had been experiencing. I heard their harrowing stories firsthand, including stories about my own alma mater, Columbia University, which has hosted some of the worst anti-Israel protests and encampments in the country. It is a terrifying time to be a Jewish student on campus. And I want to be very clear on this point, unambiguously clear. It's okay to criticize Israel or the actions of the Israeli government, just as it's okay to criticize the United States. Israel is far from perfect. We all know that. But the current protest movement laying the blame for Israel's war against Hamas at Israel's feet, accusing Israel of genocide, denying Israel's right to exist, and calling for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, that is beyond reasonable criticism of the Israeli government. It's beyond civil discourse or the free exchange of ideas. Let's call it what it is. It's anti-Semitism. It's the newest incarnation of the world's most ancient and pernicious form of hatred. When Jewish students are heckled for simply walking across campus, when Jews are screamed at on campus and told to go back to Poland, that is not defense of the Palestinian people. That is hatred of Jews, plain and simple. The precipitous spike in anti-Semitic incidents on campus didn't start after the war in Gaza began. It didn't start after the IDF went into Rafah or after thousands of Palestinians had already been killed. The 300% rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses started on October 7th. On the worst day of violence against Jews since the Holocaust, college students in this country responded by spewing hatred for Jews. That, in and of itself, speaks volumes about where we are. Yet despite how difficult things are on campus, the resolve of our students has not been broken. Last year, Hillel engagement was at an all-time high. Over 180,000 Jewish students across the country engaged with Hillel in some way, shape, or form since October 7th. That's remarkable. But what's even more remarkable is the fact that in the midst of the chaos of this past year, our Jewish students spoke up and spoke out. I want to highlight a letter that was written and signed by 540 Jewish students at Columbia University, including our own TBS members Sophie Kassan and Talia Rabban, at the peak of the protest movement this past spring. Here's what that letter said. We, the Jewish students at Columbia University, proudly believe in the Jewish people's right to self-determination in our historic homeland as a fundamental tenet of our Jewish identity. We connect to Israel not only as our ancestral homeland, but as the only place in the modern world where Jews can safely take ownership of their own destiny. Our experiences at Columbia over the past 6 months are a poignant reminder of just that. One thing is for sure, we will not stop standing up for ourselves. We are proud to be Jews, and we are proud to be Zionists. And I am so proud of the Columbia students who wrote and signed that letter, because that letter is the ultimate inversion of expectations. The protesters planned, and our Jewish students laughed. And so too has it been for Jews at all stages of life. Since October 7th, we have been seeing what Jewish sociologists are calling the Great Surge, a miraculous reawakening of Jewish engagement. Jews are coming back to synagogues in droves. People are applying to Jewish jobs and seeking Jewish community at unprecedented levels. According to a study conducted by the Jewish Federations of North America, prior to October 7th, 83% of American Jews felt only somewhat, not very, or not at all engaged. But since October 7th, 30%, roughly a third of American Jews now identify as feeling deeply engaged. That's incredible. We are living through a major paradigm-shifting moment for the American Jewish community. And I have seen that firsthand this year at Temple Beth Shalom. You may remember that less than a week after October 7th, on Friday, October 13th, Hamas called for an international day of violence against Jews. And in defiance of Hamas's terrible proclamation, we here at TBS planned an Israel solidarity service here in our sanctuary, knowing full well that people might not show up on that day because synagogues specifically were being targeted. Well, not only did people show up, but our sanctuary was as full as I can ever remember seeing it at any service outside of the high holidays. And a month later, I led a bus full of TBS members to Washington, D.C. for the March on Israel rally at the National Mall. 300,000 people were at that rally in person, and 300,000 people watched online. And on that day, I was able to recite a special bracha, a special blessing that is only recited in the presence of 600,000 Jews, the same number of Jews who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. I've never recited that blessing before, and I imagine that I'll never recite it again. In the midst of all the hatred, all the destruction, all of the anti-Semitism, more Jews than had ever come together before in the history of American Jewry came together to publicly declare to the world that we are proud to be Jewish. In other words, the skyrocketing rates of anti-Semitism in this country have backfired. Not only are Jews not afraid, we are prouder, we are more engaged, we are stronger than we have ever been. Once again, we have upended the world's expectations. Many commentators have pointed out that the Hebrew word sochek, which means to laugh, is etymologically connected to the word soek, which means to scream or to cry out. And on Rosh Hashanah, we acknowledge both of these human responses. We read the story of the birth of Yitzchak, a story about laughter, and we hear the cry of the shofar, which emulates the sound of a human voice weeping. This past year has been a year defined by both weeping and laughing, both tragedy and triumph, both disaster and hope. But as I reflect upon everything that has happened this past year, the most difficult year for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, it's the laughter and not the crying, the strength and not the victimhood that I want to remember most. As I have said from this bima before, after October 7th, two kinds of Jews emerged: October 7th Jews and October 8th Jews. October 7th Jews focus on the tragedy, on the loss, on the victimhood that defined the Jewish people on October 7th. But the day after October 7th was October 8th. And on October 8th, the Jewish people were as strong, as united, as resilient as we have ever been. And now, a year after that horrific day, each and every one of us has a choice. Are we October 7th Jews? Are we Jews defined by tragedy and victimhood? Or are we October 8th Jews? Jews defined by strength and by our unique ability to overturn the world's expectations again and again and again. Do we define ourselves by the crying of the shofar or by the laughter of Abraham and Sarah? The truth is, we are defined by both, and we have always been defined by both. Today, the shofar will cry as we mourn the incalculable losses we have suffered this past year. But remember, the Jewish people were not born in tears of sorrow. We were born in tears of laughter. As Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch put it, from the very beginning, the Jewish people have been a historic absurdity. We are the greatest joke the world has ever known because we have inverted the world's expectations for thousands of years. And despite Hamas, despite Hezbollah, despite Iran, we will continue to upend the world's expectations for thousands of years still to come. Shana Tova and Am Yisrael Chai.